Hello, 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 everybody, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Shh. It's, of course, a live podcast where we talk about love, intimacy, relationships, and everything that goes along with it. It's a lot. So, who am I? For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, my name is Tila. I'm a sex educator, relationship expert, and published author. I do this because I love helping people connect with a part of themselves that a lot of people struggle with, which is their sexuality. And it doesn't matter what sexual orientation you have. It doesn't matter, what preferences you have. Everybody has their own sort of thing. And the best way to get the most out of that part of your life is to embrace who you are. And I love helping people figure that out through education, information, conversation, and all that kind of good stuff. Now, for anybody joining us for the very first time, this is a live podcast, so the comments and the comments you guys post actually show up right in the video feed. And of course, we do also accept live callers. As many of you who've been on these calls before know that I am very fond of saying there's no such thing as a stupid question. So if somebody has a question, please be kind and supportive. We want a nice, fun environment where everybody can feel safe to talk about what is troubling them. So, opening up the phone box now. So if you want to call in with a question, a comment, or a thought, the number, of course, is toll free at 1-877-777-5589. And if you want to call in about something that isn't even not the topic today, feel free. We can always come back to the topic. Not a big deal. So this week we are continuing on with our exploration of gender equality and sexism. And today's topic is toxic femininity. Now, this is actually a super under-researched and not very frequently discussed phenomenon. And like toxic masculinity, there are aspects of it that are often misrepresented, misunderstood, and in this case can actually often be interpreted as victim blaming, and in some cases be legitimately victim blaming or gaslighting, which we'll talk about in a different episode. So it's important to talk about things like toxic femininity because it is one side of a complicated issue that stands in the way of real gender equality. So I know that some people are like, why are we talking about this? Is this really a significant issue? And yeah, it is. It is because it causes problems that causes people to react in specific ways, which perpetuate negative stereotypes, which perpetuate sexism. So everybody has a responsibility to ending sexism and to moving us closer to gender equality. And that's every single person, regardless of their gender. So, toxic femininity is another thing that sort of eats away at that effort and that progress that we do make. So many behaviors have evolved over time and often in response to the world around them. Something happens, we respond to it, and things become a defense mechanism, a means of survival, and a means of regaining power in a world that is full of power imbalances. And one of the most challenging things about toxic femininity, and probably one of the reasons why it's fairly under-discussed, is that sometimes, or a lot of the time, it can be really difficult to untangle toxic femininity from things caused by victim blaming and sexism. Sometimes things that happen can easily be explained by other means or other motivations. And the difference between toxicity and those responses often comes down to like deliberate maliciousness in this case. Someone of any gender can be deliberately malicious or intentionally hurtful, and women are no exception to this. And in some cases, there are cases where women have used that to their advantage. So it is a way that some women have chosen to regain power in a world where women still face a lot of challenges. However, it does stand in the way of progress towards real gender equality because it causes a lot of resentment and also perpetuates some of the things that, spawn toxic masculinity and sexism. So it's an important thing to talk about. It's no secret that women have been described as crazy, irrational, emotional, needy, whatever. We've all heard someone talk about that crazy ex-girlfriend, and this has been the subject of many movies and often arguments for keeping women out of holding positions of power. And in many cases, a lot of these claims are actually unfounded and based on entirely sexist reasons. But in some cases, it can come from unhealthy and bad behavior that is toxic. So this is why it's such a difficult thing to talk about, because women do face a lot of discrimination and women do face a lot of sexism. And so and they also get told that they're wrong a lot. But that doesn't makes it challenging, because in some cases the women are wrong, but when you're always telling women are wrong, there's the resistance as well to that. And there's also a lot of times people will call it toxic femininity when it is not. So it kind of continues to muddy the water, makes people resentful, makes it challenging. Does that make sense? Everybody following me so far? Just seeing how many people we got tuned in today. All right. Okay, so what does toxic femininity look like? What does that mean? What does that even look like? So there's a couple different examples. Things like could be behaving excessively negatively, or with an extremely sharp temper, or exaggerating distress and justifying all that bad behavior because it's that time of the month. Using that time of the month to get out of certain things that are less desirable. Or it might look like deliberately putting on an act of helplessness to get out of, doing an unpleasant task. It could also look like things like, coercing men into sex by any means. And that could be like guilt or regret or even mocking their sexuality when they're not giving consent to sex. And it's a common stereotype that men always want sex. They do not, nor should they feel that they always need to have sex. So that's sort of one of those things where it's toxic femininity because it's also perpetuating negative stereotypes, right? And feeding into those negative stereotypes. And no one should ever use coercion for sex. It doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter what your gender of your partner is. Coercion should never enter into sex unless it is previously consented to in a role play scenario. So that's definitely toxic. Things like expecting men to always want sex, or maybe even feeling that the man should be happy because they're like, it's a privilege that they're getting to have sex with this particular woman. A lot of research shows that many women are more likely to be perpetrators of emotional abuse. I did a whole episode on emotional abuse in the first week of our podcast. So if you missed it, please go back and check it out. It was long, informative, and I whipped through a lot of the topic very quickly because I wanted to cover a bunch of it, and I probably should have broken that up into a whole week, but I did it in one episode. It's definitely worth a listen. It's pretty important stuff. I also have some written articles on my website about identifying emotional abuse. But yeah, women are often perpetrators of emotional abuse because of the dynamics that often play in particularly in heterosexual couples. There are some women who are also physically abusive towards their male partners. And that's often because they believe that, men can't be abused, or that maybe they just think that there aren't any repercussions because nobody's going to believe them anyway, or the stigma of men coming forward who've been abused, which is a whole other issue. We don't actually have accurate numbers for how many women are abusers. I mean, I think it's safe to go on a limb that more men are abusers, just based on the statistics that we do have. But we actually don't know what the total number of men are because it's so highly underreported, which is unfortunate. Another sign of toxic femininity could be, things like lying about taking birth control or faking a pregnancy just to see how people will respond. It could also look like, manipulating a case of child custody or legal rights and a divorce to be hurtful to the former partner. Sometimes this is done through, false allegations of abuse or that sort of thing. There's also a lot, this actually comes up a little bit more than most people realize, but some women will belittle men for their abilities to do what are like traditionally thought of as female or women focused tasks, such as like cleaning, cooking, or the big one, parenting. I wrote an article about this a while back, but there's actually some research that shows interviewing fathers and about their perceived parenting ability, and most of the fathers felt that they were inadequate, particularly after they've been criticized by their female partner. And they find that they actually interact with their children less to avoid that criticism. So men could be better parents in many cases if they were given more support to be better parents and less criticism. It's also possible, and actually kind of likely, and this is actually probably a better known phenomenon, although it's not really talked about as toxic femininity, but women often tend to bully other women quite a lot, up to 70% actually. And, often it's for the choices that women make, or it could be their perceived femininity. A lot of this is sort of played out, and talked about like gossip or hurtful backstabbing, that group of friends who's really polite to your face, but says all sorts of nasty stuff behind your back. And that's a great example of toxic femininity between women. And unfortunately is quite prevalent and in some cases socially condoned in our society as just part of the way things are, which is kind of unfortunate. Women should be supportive of other women. People should be supportive of other people, regardless of gender. But there's a lot of the time women will attack other women either for adhering too strongly to misogynistic ideals of, upheld in the patriarchy, or by not conforming to them. There's a lot of criticism for women and what they do and what they don't do, and in some cases it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Either way, somebody's going to be criticizing you, how you act, how you dress, how you interact with the world, how you raise your kids, how you choose to go through your pregnancy. Women are pretty much remarked upon at any point in this world, and a good portion of that does come from other women. So it's a lot of social pressure. There is another side to toxic femininity, and it's sort of the opposite flip side, where it's a little bit more internal. So it can be presented as something like that a woman does to herself. And this can happen because women are highly socialized to be caretakers. We're raised to believe that we're responsible for maintaining relationships, and if relationships fail, it's our fault. If you've ever seen like some sort of girls movie where, or a girls sitcom where, a breakup happens and the girl's talking to her old girlfriends and, oh, what's wrong with me? Why doesn't he like me? All that kind of stuff. When a relationship fails, women tend to blame themselves because they've been raised to believe that it's their job to maintain that relationship. So Sometimes can be referred to or seen as internal misogyny, where a woman's femininity is defined by their adherence to like that misogynistic, very one-dimensional perception of femininity in the patriarchy. Devon Price is a non-binary social psychologist and writer, and tends to look at toxic femininity as part of, as a byproduct of like our strict adherence to that gender binary. Because that strict adherence to the gender binary is sort of forcing that idea of what femininity should be. And, this is what spawns all the stuff that we talked about before, plus the tendency to be self-critical. So, toxic femininity through this lens of internal, that can look like a bunch of different things, like blaming self for a failed relationship, that woman who won't let herself eat anything but salad on a date. Every piece of clothing has to be delicate and thin and pretty and lacy, and, high heels and basically that like sense of hyper femininity. It may also manifest as maybe the belief that women are too fragile or docile to play in contact sports, or that real women wouldn't want to because it's dirty and it's violent. It's sort of, can also look at that as the belief that women can't be violent, which also is not true. So toxic femininity may not be about abusive behaviors, but it can also be about defining femininity so shallowly that a woman can be degendered by just basic human acts or natural preferences. Does that make sense, everybody? Everybody with me so far? How are we feeling? Doing okay? Now, it's sort of like a new concept for a lot of people, so I don't want to whip through it too quickly. Just give you guys a minute to let that sink in. So toxic femininity can look like a lot of different things. And like I said, that's what makes it so challenging, particularly in the light of it coming across, or some natural and completely justifiable reactions to some things being defined as toxic. And, that's usually what we call gaslighting. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of gaslighting. There's lots of people that talk about it. I don't want to get too much into it here because we could probably do quite a lot on gaslighting. But yeah, so the idea that femininity is so narrowly defined is, I think, I have to agree with Devon Price. I think that is a problem that perpetuates this sort of issue. And like toxic masculinity, which we discussed yesterday, there's a lot of variance and range in what it can mean and how it can be defined by people. I think it's an important conversation to have, and it's an important conversation that we need to have more of, mostly because if we don't, there's some people that sort of feel that there is no wrong that women can perpetuate, which is not correct. I mean, as far as all the different genders, we are all in this together. No one is perfect. Absolutely no one. And when you have sexism, which has existed for an exceptionally long period of time, and those effects, and how it has affected women, and how women have survived and fought against that, through the generations, there's always going to be some potential negative side effects that come from that. And I don't just mean like things that are done to women, but also things that women end up perpetuating. And sometimes that's a matter of survival. Sometimes that's a matter of trying to regain power. However, it does stand in the way of progress. It stands in the way of ending that sexism. The more we feed into those cycles, the stronger they become. A lot of relationships find challenges because people fall into a particular pattern of responses. And once you sort of continue to follow that pattern of responses over and over and over again, it becomes harder and harder and harder to break out of them. And that's because it feels natural. I feel this is a natural response. It's become a natural response. It's something we've trained ourselves to do. So challenging that and breaking out of that, one, is going to feel kind of uncomfortable. Two, is going to be difficult. Three means we need to make new patterns. We need to change the script of what is happening. And that's why it's so important to talk about things like toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. When you look at any type of relationship, anything taken to an extreme or taken out of context can potentially be toxic. It doesn't matter regardless of gender. It can be any gender, any relationship. It's about what is the context of that in the given relationship, and how is it impacting people. And in many cases, like toxic masculinity, toxic femininity has some potentially devastating effects. People suffer with mental health as well. There's depression, there's anxiety, there's feelings of helplessness. A lot of the bullying that's perpetuated due to toxic femininity can cause feelings of isolation, which of course don't help with mental health at all. So it's pretty important area. And on the flip side, for some of the behaviors that, toxic femininity has impacts on men, it is going to feed that fear and feed that concern that some men have about moving towards gender equality. Some people hold this perception that gender equality would mean that, that the way that women are treated or have been treated in the past is how men would be treated in the future. And that's not gender equality. All that is it's swinging the pendulum in the other direction. You're doing the same thing, you're just switching how it happens. That's not equality. That's not how we move towards equality. That is not what equality looks like. We need to break out of those patterns. We need to start new patterns. And so, like I said, the more we feed into some of these things, the more resistant and the harder it's going to be to achieve real equality. Does that make sense? I know this week we've talked quite a bit about sexism and how it applies to the gender binary. That's sort of the easiest thing to speak to, really, because how it affects the gender binary sort of impacts how it impacts or how it affects other genders as well. So it's an important starting place. How are we feeling, everybody? Are you still with me so far? Looks like it. That's good. Okay. So I wanted to, sort of in the discussion of toxic femininity, wanted to talk about what people talk about is reverse sexism, which is something that sort of comes up when we start talking about behaviors, negative behaviors that are perpetuated by primarily women. And there's this term that gets thrown around a lot of reverse sexism. It is very important to make the distinction that anyone of any gender can be sexist to another person of any gender. Okay? Sexist attitudes do not hold to a particular gender. Anybody can perpetuate them, anyone can feed into them, anybody can be part of them. However, I have to object to the term reverse sexism. While it is, like I said, possible to be sexist towards a particular individual, reverse sexism more refers to it as a larger scale is usually what people talk about. Like, oh, it's a reverse sexism like movement. It's, usually it's typically cisgendered men who bring this up. But there's that whole concern of like, oh, well, women are just going to treat men really bad. It's reverse sexism. It's sexism against men. And the distinction I want to make is that when you're looking at systemic issues, for example, systemic sexism, and this applies to systemic racism too, the dominant group who has benefited from the systemic issue, there's no such thing as reverse whatever. There's no reverse sexism. There's no reverse racism. You are not going to be discriminated against on a systemic level because of the privilege you hold. Privilege, I understand, is a difficult concept for many people. I think that's sort of a full discussion of privilege is something that's best done on its own. I don't think we would be able to cover everything that would need to be covered for privilege right now. So we will talk about it, a full discussion of it at a different time. But reverse sexism is not a thing. People may behave badly from other people, but the institutions and systemic things that are set up are not going to discriminate against a privileged group, nor are they likely to. So please don't say that. It's not a thing. That being said, if you are someone, and I actually had this discussion with a friend just the other day, he was saying how he felt frustrated because sometimes people just assume that he is sexist, not because of anything he said, but because he just, he is a white male. So therefore, he feels that sometimes just people naturally interpret. And what I said to him was that as part of a privileged group, the job of privileged groups is to listen to people of minorities. It doesn't matter what minority it is. If someone has less privilege than you in some way, just shut up and hear what they have to say. And that can be frustrating and uncomfortable sometimes. And you know what? Sometimes it doesn't apply to you, but it can be a fantastic way to use your privilege. So if someone from a less privileged group than you is speaking, use your privilege to listen, okay? Because that can have a huge effect to the person you're speaking to. If a woman feels that men never listen to women, and you're a man and you're like, well, I listen to women, are you listening to her right now? No, you're not. You're proving her point that men don't listen. So it's always better, don't argue. Use your privilege for good. If a woman's speaking, oh, men never listen, men never listen, men never listen, that is the most perfect time and cue for you to listen, because it is not about you. Some people have been incredibly hurt and experienced a ton of trauma. And trauma is life-altering. It's intense. It's hard. And sometimes people have a hard time seeing past their trauma. That doesn't mean that they have the right to go around and verbally abuse other people, but we can be understanding. And we can, if we have the capacity to, we can do our little part to try to help them process their trauma. Not in a therapist kind of way, but just simply by listening. So if you feel that it's unfair, people are making assumptions about you based on your gender or based on your ethnicity, please try not to argue. Just listen to what they have to say. That is honestly one of the most powerful things that you can do as a privileged class. Does that make sense? How are we doing? Okay, well, that was pretty much all I kind of wanted to cover today on toxic femininity. Our next show will be tomorrow, June 19th, 8 p.m. Pacific time, 11 p.m. Eastern. If you're looking for more information, please check out my website. There's tons and tons and tons of articles on there, ranging in subjects. And I also want to say that I'm going to mention this tomorrow as well, but we're actually going to be changing the format for Let's Talk About Shh. And the format is going to change. So Let's Talk About Shh was started 5 weeks ago. So tomorrow will be our 25th episode and 5 weeks that we've been doing Monday to Friday. And I will be honest and say that it is a lot of work to put together the information and make sure that I'm putting everything together in a good way that's going to make sense to people. And it's usually about 2 hours of prep per episode. So at this time, I've made the decision to, now that we've sort of given it a good 5 weeks to sort of get the launch in, that we're going to be dropping to once a week. And that's going to start effective next week. So this will be our last week doing 5 days. So if you have any input on what days you would like to see the live podcast happen, please leave it in the chat or send me an email, send me a message, whatever you like. I am sort of leaning towards Wednesdays. Those seem to be really high attendance days. So we're tentatively looking at Wednesday evenings at 8 p.m. Anyway, thank you guys so much, everybody, for tuning in today. I hope you guys enjoyed today's show, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Have a good night, everybody.